Hey everyone, I'm sure that everyone's a little disappointed not to be able to meet up in Arizona for the Summer Institute like we usually do, but hopefully we get a chance to interact a little bit here in this module. I want to talk to you a little bit about sports science. We'll discuss this throughout the week, and I hope that those of you who work in sports that you get a different perspective on how sports science can be implemented in your programs. If you're not in sports, hopefully there's at least some scientific value here. But nonetheless, we'll try to get through this and hope that we get a chance to connect. If you haven't been following sports science or in recent years, I want to take you through a quick history so that you kind of see some of the background and the evolution of sports science. But just real quick, a little bit about me. I've been with A.T. Still University for nearly 16 years now. I actually was the original chair of the program, started the program from scratch. It's been a great experience. But 4 or 5 years into the program, I had some opportunities I wanted to get out and pursue. So I moved to a faculty position, and that allowed me to move around and accept some consulting work in sports, but also take on some full-time roles in other programs. I was a head of sports science at IMG Academy for a year in Florida. Last 2 years, I was the high performance coordinator with Indiana University football. And in February of this year, Coach Saban called and offered me a position as the director of sports science with Alabama football, which I've been doing for the last 5 months, even though it has been a strange 5 months with the virus stoppage. But I'll show you some in there how things from my life have evolved in sports science as we go through here and bring in some personal experiences. But just real quick, if you're not familiar with it, I think anything where we apply science to sport classifies as sports science. A lot of that is data driven, but the different disciplines in sports science or the different disciplines in performance include nutrition, psychology, strength conditioning, and sports medicine. And sports science is best, most effective when it's embedded in those different disciplines. Meaning, I work very closely with our sports nutritionist. If there's the need to gather some data or to look at trends or data presentation, there's a collaborative effort there. I'll talk a lot about the work with strength and conditioning. That's kind of my background in training, but really just being embedded within these different disciplines to make sure that our decisions are data driven, that we're paying attention to things that data might be telling us with our athletes. So again, anything that is scientifically driven and applied to sports would classify as sports science. GPS data collection has garnered the most immediate attention. That is a small aspect of sports science. In many places, I haven't even used that. So you certainly can have a very good sports science effort without it. But many people have seen in the media recent years the use of GPS data as a way to try to prevent injuries, and it's labeled sports science, but again, that's a very small aspect of it. It's been going on for centuries. There's accounts in ancient Olympic times of different substances being studied and used for performance enhancement. The modern Olympic Games, the Soviet Union had an extensive sports science program that they were operating. The United States Olympic Training Center started to grow and develop around in that same span of time. But what happens is from 2000 on, when the Olympics were going to happen in Australia, the Australian government invested a great deal of money into sports science and athlete development, and built a sports science center, developed a nationwide sports science program. Colleges started to offer some sports science offerings, and so um, the Australian Institute of Sport caught some good attention from the Olympics and for sports science. Same thing happened when the Olympics were going to happen in London. Uh, so you, this the point is that it's not very new, but you see different trends and different things get media attention over time. And in reality, dating back, I don't date myself, but when I first started as a college student, um, exercise science departments were actually called exercise and sports science departments, and had been named that for some time. And the sports science part started getting dropped off because there wasn't a lot of funding for research in sport. So departments were just focusing on exercise and health. But again, in reality, sports science in academic worlds has been around for a long time. In the sporting world, certainly it has played a key role in it for centuries. I'll talk a little bit about what I see in terms of the role of sports science, or the sports scientist. Uh, if we look at all of that, the athlete encounters a number of different entities as part of the development process. Those entities often work by themselves, although you can imagine how they should be and usually are very integrated. But it's the role of the sports scientist to try to bring all of this together, to communicate across disciplines. For instance, one of my roles here at Alabama, it was at Indiana, is to kind of be a liaison between strength and conditioning and sports medicine. Spent a lot of time working with athletes that are in the post-rehab phases where, the design of the program is often a hybrid from the sports medicine staff and from the strength and conditioning staff, and making sure that athletes are getting what they really need at the right time is something that I work very extensively on. Um, because of that role, I get our strength and conditioning and our sports medicine staff on the same page, whether it be sitting in meetings. Um, I've encouraged our sports medicine staff to be on the floor with us during strength and conditioning sessions. That doesn't happen in a lot of places, and so that just building a good working relationship between those two. If I see an athlete that is having issues that need to be addressed from a nutrition standpoint or from a psychological standpoint, um, I broker those conversations with those disciplines. Um, but it's really just it's a work between role where sometimes you have to wear many different hats. I don't wear any hat, but uh, I try to to do a little bit of everything and just make sure that the right people are involved at the right time. Um, Specific roles, and I'll talk a lot about my current situation. Um, I'm expected and asked to contribute to optimum athlete development. Dr. or Dave Ballou and I, Dave is the head strength and conditioning coach here. He's actually a graduate of the AT Still program. That's where I met him. Um, he was then at IMG working with football. So he and I worked together there, and then he recruited me to go to Indiana with him. And then he's also came here with me as well to Alabama. We have a very extensive testing process. Our testing's built into our training sessions, so we accrue a lot of data. The Elite Form system is something that we use a lot. The 1080 motion system is one that we use a lot. And we gather an incredible amount of data every day. And my role is to take that the data, and turn it into information that he can use to alter training programs for the team or for each individual athlete. That's a pretty extensive system that takes up the bulk of my time. We also use science and my role to try to make good decisions. Sometimes you see certain people that uh, certain places make decisions solely based off of wins and losses. In fact, I'll tell you a story. I was meeting with an NFL general manager, and we were talking about decision making in sports science, and I asked him, I said, how do you know that your strength and conditioning coach is good or bad or not good? How do you know that your sports nutrition program is good or bad or wonderful? And he said, well, I don't know anything about those areas. So if we win on Sunday, I assume those things are good. If we don't, then I have to assume that those things might not be that great. Um, there's a problem there because, we've probably all seen situations where wins and losses are affected by a lot of different things. And we need to make good decisions based off of validation, off of reliability, off of data. Um, so part of my role is to make sure that we're doing everything we can off the field, and in Coach Saban's mind, that's a process, and he's known for trusting the process. And so my job is to make sure that we can trust the process. Um, the other thing that I think we can do, that I've been tasked with here, is to identify areas where we can innovate and evolve. Coach Saban has been incredibly successful, um, perhaps the most successful college coach of all time. And one of the first things he told me that I needed to do was to evaluate every aspect of this entire program, uh, look at everything, make sure that I'm critical of everything, find ways that we can do better, find things that we need to advance, find places where we might be falling behind. I greatly appreciate and respect that, especially from a very successful coach. And um, that challenges some of the status quo. That challenges people who have been successful doing things a certain way, but stimulates innovation. So I'm tasked with those things, not that I have all the answers to them, but I am tasked with the process of evaluating every aspect of the program. I think sports scientists have a unique background and skill set to be able to communicate with people in the different entities within the program, but also understand the data-driven process that can be used to evaluate different entities in the most valid and reliable way. All right, so here's some examples. I'm just going to throw some examples out to you. If you have interest in sports science, I'm hoping that maybe I can show you some things that, again, beyond GPS data, which most people do and view as sports science, show you how it's embedded into other aspects. You probably all learned about the SAID principle, or specificity of training. I know we talk about it in some of our sports conditioning classes. You probably faced it or found it in exercise physiology, but basically the principle states that the body will adapt to the specific stresses that we place on the body, and the different systems that adapt are specific to the stresses that we impose on the body. That's a great concept, and it's a valid one. It absolutely is tried and true. The way that we look at things, though, from a data-driven standpoint, changes how we evaluate specificity of training. I want you to think about this quote from Mel Siff in the book Super Training. And if any of you, if you're working in sports, if you're working in strength and conditioning, that's definitely one of the Bibles that I hold in my library and refer to pretty often. It's a fairly hard read. It takes some time to get through, but there's some great concepts in there, and I give Mel quite a bit of credit for the level of thinking that he displays there. But read this. This is a quote from the chapter on specificity of training. It is vital to remember that all exercise involve information processing. The body, the nervous system is gathering information about a squat, about a power clean, about a press, a pull. It's processing that information, so that all training should be regarded as a way in which the body's extreme complex computing systems are programmed and applied in the solution of all motor tasks. So basically, we need to view exercise as a way to provide a stimulus to the body, principally the nervous system, to gather information and enact a response with motor tasks. That's pretty deep. That's a very high level way of viewing exercises versus, well, we're just going to go lift something heavy today, set it down, and we'll just lift it again. This is a pretty high level process. Well, Zatsiorsky in his book, Science and Practice of Strength Training, took it even one step further and proposed an equation to actually quantify how much transfer you can get from one exercise to a sports skill. I would argue that transfer is actually what we should be speaking of, not necessarily specificity of training. And you'll see this when we talk about some exercises in a minute. But in that chapter in Super Training, Mel talks about 10 different aspects of specificity. The more of those 10 aspects are covered in an exercise, the greater the transfer. And that deals with energy systems and movement patterns and speed and all. The more specific the exercise, the more transfer you'll get. But movement specificity is just one of those 10. Speed is just one of those 10. So I hear a lot of track coaches say, well, the value of the exercises in the weight room are low because the speeds are so low that they don't mimic the speeds that you sprint at. Well, they're right. Speed specificity is one of 10 aspects of transfer. So if I have 9 of the others and I'm lacking one, in this case, speed specificity, I still have a very high transfer exercise. And we need to keep that in mind. Well, Zatsiorsky says here's an equation, and if you're a math nerd like me, you actually will dive into that equation and start to really look at it. But basically what it's taking is a ratio between how much the exercise improves to how much the sport skill improves. And an exercise that doesn't improve very much, but shows an incredible improvement in the sport skill has very high transfer, versus an exercise that might improve tremendously, but show very little impact on the sports skill. That would have low transfer. Well, I started maybe 12 years ago, started gathering research articles out of the literature and started calculating transfer from many different exercises. Most of the conventional ones that you would think of that would be applied in sports performance. And then looking at different sports skills like sprinting and jumping, throwing, and swinging, and actually calculating the transfer following training programs to those different sports skills. I came up with this. I have this chart. Coach Blue and I look at it, when we want to improve. If we have an issue with jumping in the database, we'll look at the list and we'll look at exercises that transfer the most to jumping, and we'll start incorporating more of those exercises into our program, rather than just saying, well, I think the squat's awesome for jumping. We'll squat and clean and deadlift, and we'll just do those because that's what we normally do, and we just think that they're great for jumping. Instead, we can actually look at data to say which exercises have the highest transfer to jumping. I'll show you the transfer to speed, because this will stimulate a little bit more of a discussion that I hope will end up in the discussion forum this week. Here's the top 10 and the bottom 10 exercises for speed. I could find data on 31 different exercises, enough data on 31 different exercises to calculate transfer to speed. And you can look at number 1 through 10, and the specifics of those exercises is less important than some of the characteristics of those exercises. And if you look at what the top 10 have in common what the bottom 10 have in common, you'll probably see that the top 10 are generally single leg or split stance exercises versus the bottom 10, which are mainly bilateral exercises. So I can now take that concept and say, if I want to increase transfer to speed, I'm going to do more single leg or split stance exercises. And that's a way that now I have taken a concept, put data behind it, and now then made an actionable decision based off of the data. And that, again, that's kind of the approach that Coach Blue and I have taken, that we're not going to simply rely on tradition or our opinions on what exercises are best for certain things. We're going to rely on data to drive our decision making. Another one that I'll put in here, actually, I'll try to include this study in the module, in the folder for the reading, so you can actually read this one. But I think this is probably the best well-rounded study I've ever completed. It took me years and years to get enough data built up. But basically, it's examining squat depth in very highly trained athletes. And the only difference in training is the depth at which they would do the squat. Loads were equated, volume was equated, speeds were equated. The only difference being how far down in the squat the group would go. You can look through the data, and again, you'll get the study, so you can evaluate all of this and kind of think through what you know. But my point, as it relates to sports science, is looking at data in different ways. Traditionally in research, we calculate the p-value, right? If it's less than 0.05, then it's significant. We're encouraged to publish some measure of the magnitude of change. Some people use percent increase. The effect size has been one that I've used a lot, probably the preferred way. But now I'm adding in here on the very bottom a coefficient of transfer, which is that calculation that I just showed you from Zatsiorsky. If you look at what these different calculations show us, you'll see some similarities in there. But if in reality my biggest interest is how much an exercise transfers to a sports skill, in this case, by the way, it was looking at vertical jump and 40-yard sprint or speed as the two sports skills. If I really want to know how much an exercise transfers to vertical jump and speed, I need to calculate that. I should not infer it from effect size, certainly not from percent increase. So, one of the main points that I was trying to make in this paper is the value of this coefficient of transfer calculation. But once again, we go through, and I hope you'll actually read the study, and specifically the discussion section where I and some of my practitioner colleagues spent a lot of time discussing and debating and working on what we take away from this. And from a sports science standpoint, again, Coach Blue and I will look at an athlete, and let's just say an athlete needs to improve sprinting speed. We'll generally do a quarter squat with bands for a speed squat day and a full squat that is heavier and slower for a strength squat day. And then we'll play with how often we put an athlete into one or both of those situations. An athlete that needs more speed will probably get more quarter speed squat days than deep slow days. An athlete that might need some improvement in vertical jump might get a little bit more half squat depth, but primarily going to be quarter squat depth. Once again, because we see data that are helping us to make decisions beyond just what our opinions are on quarter, full, or half squat depths. We're just trying to take guessing out of the equation as well as our own personal opinions. Because we all have opinions, we all have agendas, we all have ideas, and what we want to avoid is allowing those opinions and agendas to influence the development of our athlete and the main outcome, which for us in college football is when to keep your job. So you can go through that paper and some of those ideas in the note slides, but I hope that stimulates a little bit of thought. The last one that I'll bring up is velocity-based training, probably the most valid and valuable concept that I've studied in 25 years of my career. It continues to advance. We still have a lot of questions about it, but of all the concepts I've studied, this one's a really, really good one, and it certainly demonstrates the integration of sports science with strength and conditioning. If you're interested in some of the background historical parts of velocity-based training, I highly recommend Brian Mann and some of his writing. I put a link there that might guide you to a good paper to start with. He's done some good work on velocity-based training. But in essence, what this does is instead of prescribing loads, we're actually prescribing speed. And just so that we're clear, dating clear back to IMG, which was 5 years ago, Coach Blue and I have not prescribed anything but speeds for our football players. So we know that we want to develop a certain muscular component, and we know that there are certain speeds that will target that muscular component in our training. Therefore, we set a speed that we want the athlete to hit. We do have estimations of what loads would be appropriate for those speeds, but you adjust based off of daily readiness and adaptation. If an athlete is way higher, much faster than the prescribed speed, then you add load in order to slow them down and get them to the right zone. If it's too slow and they're not feeling it that day, we'll start dropping load so that they can increase their speed and get to the zone that we want them to be in. And then we periodize the speed in order to target a different trait. I would say, other than maybe speed strength, which is in there most of the year for us, we just cycle through some of these different traits so that we get constant adaptation. But what I want to show you on the right-hand side of this is a graph that we get from Elite Form. Elite Form's a camera system. You can look that up and study that a little bit, but just an incredible amount of data. We get a graph like this. This is one repetition of the squat. So we get this concentric phase. Actually, there's one for the eccentric phase as well, but this is concentric phase. And you can see as speed goes up, that graph climbs. And you can actually identify where peak velocity occurred. We saw this graph, and I started really getting interested in this time to peak velocity. So we've worked with Elite Form from about the beginning of their existence. And so I called them and said, hey, I'd like to see that as a data point. And so they built it into the data collection process. And for every single rep, we'll get a time to peak velocity. Here's kind of what it looks like. Obviously, the graphs represent different exercises: back squat on the left, rear elevated in the middle, and split jump on the right. But you can really learn a lot about what the exercise is actually doing. That this back squat here at the top, that's a heavy, slow regular back squat. It takes over a second to get to peak velocity. This one in the middle is an even slower one, but at least this athlete gets to peak velocity a little bit faster. Look at the split jumps where there's a very, very high slope to this movement. They hit peak velocity very, very quickly. So it's just a visual representation of how an athlete gets to a certain speed, which I'm still kind of early in this process because this has been 2-3 years now that we've been studying this, but it's telling us different things. And one thing that we want to accomplish is apply the right stimulus for the needed improvement. So, if I look at different variations of a squat or a jump here, uh, and I see that there are different stimulus that's being applied to the athlete, I might decide that there are times where a heavier, slower squat's appropriate, but there also might be times where that's just unnecessary. Well, that's if I look at that change over time. So look at this green graph here. Let's just say that was the athlete to start with. Their slope is very gradual. It takes them until 0.6 to reach peak velocity. We want to improve that. By the way, we've studied different things in football. The most intriguing is probably from the snap of the ball to the time where an offense and a defensive lineman engage is about 0.45 seconds. So that's this blue line here. So at the snap of the ball, whoever can exert the most force in under 0.45 seconds is going to win the battle. So regardless of how strong they are, by the way. So our goal is now to get peak velocity in a squat or clean or whatever under 0.45 seconds. And over time, what we hope to see is this black one where we hit higher velocities at higher loads, by the way, in less time. That's just that combination of force and rate of force development that will give an athlete a competitive advantage. Once again, I'm collecting the data, I'm presenting the data, I'm looking at the data, I'm evaluating the data, and then Coach Blue and I make actionable changes to an athlete's program based off of the data that we're collecting. That is probably the best depiction I can give you of an integrated sports science program that's really embedded into strength and conditioning. So let me end there. I think there's a lot left to be determined in terms of the actual value and placement of sports science in sports. But I think it's these positions of sports science in college and professional sport are here to stay. I think they are evolving significantly, but I think they're here to stay. So if you have an interest in this multidisciplinary data-driven approach, I think there's probably going to be more and more opportunities for you in athletics. And I would encourage you to start to look at many different concepts that you can study and utilize that might become valuable to a coach, to a program, and certainly to the athletes. And be ready to provide the demonstration to those people that might hire you about how you've looked at certain problems or certain data or certain situations with this data-driven decision-making in mind. Look forward to talking to you in the discussions and hope that this week turns out to be valuable for you.